All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Hive-side Chat of 2026. Quick mic check. Can everyone hear me all right? I think so. I'm not hearing those, so keep going. Yes. Thank you. Great. Well, we'll get into it then. This is our first Hive-side Chat of 2026. We are bringing back this series to help connect everyone in Canada. There's a lot of beekeeping work going on in different sections of the industry. So it's always great to connect with the people who are making a difference and trying to forward the sector. So today it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Andrew Byers, who's here from Atlantic Canada to give a talk. My name is Maren Vickers. I am hosting today as an apiary technician with the Tech Transfer Program. Andrew Byers, would you like to introduce yourself for our audience?
Sure, I can. And while I'm doing that, I'll perhaps share the PowerPoint slide. Although I will warn people, I am a monotasker, so I'm trying to do two things at once. So yes, my name is Andrew Byers, and I'm sitting right now in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And I from this part of the world. But I spend an awful lot of time on the road because, as you'll probably appreciate through the presentation, we offer a regional service with our tech transfer. So we're based out of Bible Hill in Nova Scotia, which is a small community. It's really part of Truro Bible Hill, which is an hour north of Tatamgush. Bible Hill, perhaps best known for being formerly the campus of the Nova Scotia Agricultural College and now the Dalhousie University Agricultural College. So we're based out of there, and we help and support beekeepers around the region. I've been with the tech transfer team for, this is going into my 6th year, and been involved with beekeeping for 10 plus years. I've been saying 10 plus years for a lot of years, but don't want to date myself. But yeah, the journey for me in beekeeping actually began in England. And if anybody gets over across the pond, England, there's a great beekeeping community there. And I was living there for around 20 years, working and studying and doing research and teaching, and got interested in beekeeping and became a member of the local beekeeping club, which was affiliated with the national organization. And they had great training programs, and not unlike what we do regionally and provincially here through our associations, offer that real good introduction to beekeeping. So that's where I started and moved back to back home, as we said, from Nova Scotia back to New Brunswick. Still feels like home to be in the region. And I've been involved in many aspects of the beekeeping industry since then. Have done some inspections provincially, been involved with organizations, on boards, executives of many of the associations, and now lucky to be able to work in tech transfer full time to continue that effort to promote and improve our industry. So I'm just going to get this up, and I think I don't know if Isabella or Rand, if we want to go through some housekeeping things, but we were just chatting before people joined about asking questions, and we kind of decided that it's okay to ask questions through the chat, and there's kind of natural pauses throughout the session that might lend themselves to questions as well. So just to let people know that, I think people are familiar with the chat function, I hope. Appreciate it as well, because I'm sitting in my office in Fredericton talking to a screen. So it's nice to get a little bit of a reminder that there are live bodies at the other end of this. This technology is great, and really appreciate taking advantage of it. But sometimes it is nice to have that little bit of personal contact. So please throw your questions in, and we can deal with them throughout or in those pauses as we progress. It doesn't look like there's a huge mob of people here today, so good opportunity for some discussion around this. I have prepared a presentation based on my chat with Rin and Isabella previous to the Christmas break, what people would like, and they suggested that PowerPoint slides help create a framework for presentation. So I've put some slides together. I am conscious that sometimes we're exposed to a lot of PowerPoint presentations, but I think for these purposes, it's the best way to convey data and information. But most of it will be chatting around those images and figures on the PowerPoint. And we kind of went in our talk set out some, I've called them goals for today of what maybe you would be interested in hearing. And I think that some of these will be quite explicit. I can talk about the Atlantic Tech Transfer Team for Apiculture, how we're structured. Some of them might be more implied, but I think to go through this as a kind of a list of what we want to come out the other end of this with is to understand our tech transfer team. And there is some unique aspects to that, which people will be interested in. Give an idea of the maritime industry and some, again, aspects of that maybe differ slightly or perhaps don't from what you would be used to in your province. We're fundamentally linked to the wild blueberry industry, and I hope that comes out of this presentation, the importance of the wild blueberry industry. And I've just picked a couple of things that we work on, and the tech transfer teams across the country, we work together, firstly, which is quite important, as evidenced here today by this presentation. But we are supporting beekeepers with those challenges. So I've just picked out a couple of examples, one that we all share and are familiar with, and one perhaps that's going to be new to you guys with the differences between the provinces. So that's my intention today. But as I always say, and the people who know me realize this, I'm happy to go down any rabbit holes you want to go within reason as they relate to beekeeping, particularly in Eastern Canada. I shouldn't really say Eastern Canada because that includes Quebec. We work with Quebec, and there is, you can't really separate some of the activities around wild blueberry production between Quebec and New Brunswick, but we're distinct here in the maritime region, and maybe that's even worth making those distinctions. So I do say Eastern Canada, but typically what I'm talking about for our work is the maritime regions, because the bulk of our work is done in the maritime region. So that's Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. We do extend some of our work and efforts across to Newfoundland, which again, we would be truly the Atlantic Tech Transfer Team then. But we are based in the maritime region, and the bulk of our work is done there. And I'll explain that, because one of our goals for today, one of our tasks, is to talk about what ADA is, and I think it's important. And it sounds like I may be biased, which I am, no doubt, but the work of the tech transfer teams, and as I say, I have a level of familiarity with all of the tech transfer teams across Canada through the collaborative efforts of that group. So all of the 7 teams across there, and I know that we all work similarly, although perhaps different activities, but we all work similarly to support the beekeeping industry in our province or sector. So that's one of the distinctions with ADA. We are a regional tech transfer team. The other 6 tech transfer teams across the country are provincial. So the way we are structured is that we are on, and this is important points probably to consider. We are on rolling soft funding, and by what I mean by that is we will get a block of funding for a number of years. So ADA has been in existence we've been 10 years going to 11 since 2016. And across that time period, we received initially, before I was involved directly, I was on the steering committee from the beginning, but I wasn't working directly with ADA. in 2016. But we received 2 years of funding, and that rolled into 5 more years of funding under what was called the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, or CAP funding. And that's a 5-year block of funding. Probably those of you that are working in agriculture are very familiar with these programs. And then that rolled into another 5 years of funding that will take us up to 2028 under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. So in terms of our structure, we receive that money through that program, which is fed from the federal level down to the provinces. Then those individual provinces make decisions about how they want to spend the money. So that SCAP funding, as we call it, comes through Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, their respective departments of agriculture. And then they decide how they want to allocate the money, what their priorities are. So the priorities in terms of creation of ADA, it was decided that because of the scale of the industry in each of those provinces, that they could not support an individual tech transfer team for Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. Again, you'll see when we get to some of the numbers, when you realize the scale of our industry, which differs a lot from what you would be familiar with, the reason for that. So what was formed was what was called a Pan-Atlantic Agreement. And the Pan-Atlantic Agreement was developed and managed through the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture to fund the tech transfer program. So those 3 departments of agriculture all feed in financially and in terms of other support to ADA. And then on the other side of it, we have industry support. So our industry, as I say, is interlocked with the beekeeping industry and the wild blueberry industry. So we receive direct financial support and otherwise from the Nova Scotia Beekeepers Association and the Nova Scotia Wild Blueberry Producers Association, from the New Brunswick Beekeepers Association and the New Brunswick Blueberry Association, Bluette NB Blueberries, from PEI Beekeepers Association and the PEI Wild Blueberry Association. So we receive government funding through our Pan-Atlantic Agreement. We receive funding directly from industry through the associations. Also, those groups feed into our steering committee, which overall provides governance for us. So a representative from each of the associations that I mentioned, the industry associations, will put a steering committee member forward. And the provinces have in the past elected to send their provincial apiculturists to our steering committee. So our steering committee, in its formal sense, consists of those representatives. We also invite additional people onto our steering committee. For example, although we aren't funded from Newfoundland, the executive, usually the current president and the commercial director of the Newfoundland Beekeeping Association are invited to all of our steering committee meetings because, again, they have a stake in what we're doing for the region as well. We will invite academics from universities maybe to come and sit on the steering committee, or if there's a particular knowledge expertise that we need for a discussion we're having, we could invite people in. We invite representatives from the Confederation of Mainland Mi'kmaq to represent Indigenous beekeepers in that province. So the formal steering committee is made up of those people who directly fund us, but we also ask for participation more broadly from the beekeeping industry and community of the region. So that governance gives us our strategic direction overall. Also, we're really lucky that in Nova Scotia, there's a Crown corporation called Perennia Food and Agriculture, and they provide extension and specialist services for agriculture. So unlike some other provinces where the particular crop specialist, beekeeping in this example, or blueberry production is another one, those people may sit within government. and work for the Provincial Department of Agriculture. In Nova Scotia, those people would work through the Crown Corporation of Perennia. So when the decision was made to form ADA, they decided that the natural place for us to sit would be in Perennia. So Perennia offers us our physical accommodation, so our offices and boardrooms and labs. We use Perennia's facilities, IT, marketing, finance, all of the things that when I look at this and how it's set up it's quite ideal for us, because if, for example, I have a problem with my computer today leading up to this presentation, the IT people at Perennia would help me with that. If we have to do some marketing, the marketing people at Perennia do that with us and for us. They manage our finances and aspects of our budgeting and funding claims and all that sort of thing. So we're really lucky, because what that enables us to do, and again, looking at comparisons across the country with tech transfer teams, I know it differs, but what our structure allows us to do is we take all of those administrative and management tasks out of the work of the specialists, which would be myself and our other apiculturists, and put that with Perennia. That gives us much more time to concentrate our full efforts on what we should be doing, which again, this whole structure, as you can see on the right, feeds into, you know, the direct support for the beekeepers and the direct support for the blueberry producers. So that's kind of how we're structured. And again, I think that would be an interesting comparison for looking at your own and other tech transfer teams. It works very well for us. And out of that comes what is our mandate. And I'm not going to go through our entire mandate, because most of the things, I think, as beekeepers in the room, you would say, well, that makes sense. We concentrate on education, we concentrate on honeybee health. We probably about have a 60-40 split, 60% of our time working in directly with tech transfer and extension work, and then 40% of our time, and you know, roughly 40% of our time is doing applied, regionally appropriate research. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress. But the mandate, as I say, most of the things on there would not shock anyone, that we promote sustainable practices such as integrated pest management. But what probably differs between our mandate and what you may see in other tech transfer teams is there's an emphasis on pollination. And those circles you see, if you're reading along as I'm speaking, you'd also realize that in our mandate, there is specific mention to pollination sector, because of that link with the wild blueberry industry. So on top of the other things that you would expect a tech transfer team for apiculture to undertake, we also work very heavily. And again, I would say half of our efforts are around pollination, and pollination for the most part as it is done for the wild blueberry industry. In our region, I would say, and again, I don't have an exact figure, but just to put it into some context, 95% of the pollination that's done in the Maritime region is done for wild blueberries. That's probably a conservative figure as well. We do cranberries, we do haskap, we do other fruit production, but largely we're involved in pollinating for wild blueberries. So we can see the structure and how that is set up. We can see that we get a mandate delivered to us in collaboration with all the stakeholders that I mentioned previously. And that kind of distills down into the things that we do day to day. So what we have is we have a contract, and in our contract is this exact list. I've just lifted it from there, and it tells us what we need to do. And it is essentially day to day, but overall it's what we're expected to do across the year. And I'm not going to go through this again. You can read as I'm speaking, but I think there's nothing there that would surprise anybody who's familiar with the work of a tech transfer team. To just pick out a few random examples, really. Training events. We're developing a course for that we'll be delivering in February, which again is regional, and a lot of our work, I would say most of our offerings are regional. We do some that are specific to a province, but most of it's regional. So we're offering a workshop, a full day workshop just on the business of beekeeping for commercial beekeepers. So that will be identifying the opportunities in the industry. We're having speakers come in from Farm Credit Canada to talk about opportunities for finance. We're having a speaker come in to talk about the programming, and in particularly New Brunswick in this example, that are available to commercial beekeepers. We've done a couple of exercises with academics at St. Mary's University. When I say we, I mean our industry, to develop models specific to cost of production and return on investment for beekeepers. So we're going to spend the day talking about all of those things with new and beekeepers who are looking to expand their operation. We do one big certificate program, and you can see that second one there. So certificate program for new and aspiring beekeepers. And I will take a minute just to talk about that because it's one of the most important training events we do through the year. We do it in collaboration with Dalhousie University. As I said, we're very lucky to have Dalhousie University Agricultural Campus literally in our backyard. You know, they're within a stone's throw of our offices. And we do what's called Fundamentals of Beekeeping. It's an in-depth program. We do get hobbyists come along, serious hobbyists, but mostly it's people who want to develop as commercial beekeepers. It's offered across the entire beekeeping season. It starts in March, and we have a full week block of teaching in March, and then we go to May, and we have a second full block, a full week block of teaching in May, again in January, July, and then finally we wrap that up in September. So it's in in-depth beekeeping program. They do receive a certificate in beekeeping from the university, and it's been running. That course in one form or another has been running for many, many years. Previously it was called the Modern Beekeeper. We had a transition, like all things changed through COVID, and that training changed through COVID. And we went from what was called the Modern Beekeeper to the fundamentals of beekeeping, because we did have to change the delivery, because as people appreciate through COVID, the opportunity to do things in person, face to face, changed drastically. So we did change the name just to reflect that, because we didn't want people to think it was the same as the previous training. But I know the impact of that course on our region and in Nova Scotia, where it's held, has been significant. And I know the individuals who have taken the course. I actually took the course when I moved from England to Nova Scotia. Managing bees in Nova Scotia was going to be different for me. So I thought I need to get my head around this. So I took what was then the Modern Beekeeper. We've had people who've gone on to be successful commercial beekeepers operating in our region, significant numbers of colonies. We've had people go from that. They've been influential in the industry, in government positions, in terms of being on association boards and executives of those boards. So that really is an impactful course that we do in conjunction with the university. It's a great relationship too, because the university handles all the management, administration, etc., and we just deliver the content as specialists. So that's really good. And again, as you look through that list, there's nothing there that I think would surprise anybody. The Atlantic Bee Tour, which is about halfway down, is worth mentioning. If anybody's in our region in August of the summer, if you want to come back east for a visit, the Atlantic Bee Tour is held every other year, and that's a big opportunity for beekeepers to get together, to do training, socialize as well, because you can't stop beekeepers from socializing when you get them together. And it's held every other year, and it happens to be falling this year in this summer. So lots going on. the other important thing I think that's really worth mentioning, because it's fundamental to tech transfer. When we received our funding, one of the things that I was fairly insistent on, and again, anybody been through the funding process knows you don't really insist too hard, but I really wanted to emphasize the importance of, was that there was professional development activities funded for the tech transfer team. Because as the people who are meant to support and in some ways lead the industry, we really need to know what's going on, what's current, what are the most up-to-date practices, what's changing. And in order to do that, we really need to be able to engage in professional development ourselves. So we are very lucky. It's not as much as we'd like to have, but we have a fund specific to professional development, and we commit to attending those events. And I'll give you two examples. One quickly was my colleague went to the American honey producers meeting in Florida in last month, which was a great opportunity to learn more about what's going on more broadly than just our region and even our country. And I'm looking very much forward to being in your province next month for the BTEC meeting. So I'm just going to stop for a second and say, if you're there at the BTEC meeting, I would really appreciate just coming up and saying hi, because that's an important aspect of going to these. It's not just the workshops and the sessions, but also the opportunity to talk with and engage with beekeepers. So that sort of gives the structure of ADA and what we're all about. We're a small team. There's myself and there's a full-time apiculturist, Kayla Gadet. And then also we have assigned to us, I guess you could say, I don't know how he would describe it, but the perennial livestock and field crop manager is the person that we again, it's a great relationship, because that's the person who manages us. Jonathan pretty well lets us get on with things day to day, but we have to have checks and balances in place. We have to have, sign off. I can spend so much of my budget, but at a point it becomes uncomfortable. It's like, this is a big purchase. Someone needs to sign this off. This contract needs to be signed. And again, that could be Jonathan. It could go to the CEO of a perennia to do that sort of thing. But again, just to keep everything on the straight and narrow, as we say, we have Jonathan who looks after things in the respect that I've just described. But importantly, is the small team that works full time is the team that works seasonally. And when we engage in that regional research that I have mentioned and we'll talk more about, it's important for us to kind of ramp up our activities for the beekeeping season. And in order to do that, we need more, it's all hands on deck, so to speak. And I want to just mention these people because I think it's important conceptually as something that it's what is going to move a tech transfer team forward, is the reliance on seasonal and part-time apiculturists, but also because of the stories around these individuals that I know that they won't mind me sharing, because there's kind of a theme here which I'd like to leave you to think about. So Caitlin Newton came to us 2 years ago, and she had no experience with honeybees. She had an interest, but she had no experience with honeybees. And part of what we try to do with our seasonal apiculturists is, certainly they are there to help us day to day and get the work done. And that's important. I ask any of our team what they feel about counting bees. It's the job nobody wants to do. But when we take bee samples, which we take hundreds of every year, those bee samples, we need to count how many bees are in them. If we're doing whitewashes, for example, we're trying to get 300 bees in the sample, but we need to know for our work exactly how many bees there are. So these are the activities that sometimes summer apiculturists get involved in. So Caitlin came to us and she spent 2 years. In that time, she developed a strong interest in honeybees in our industry. She's gone on, she's doing her honors. She was indecisive about doing an honors program, but she's smart and capable. So she was encouraged by her professors and us do an honors program, and she decided she wanted to do something around honeybees. She's graduating this year, but I hope the interest she's developed in the last couple of years means that she gets some job related to that experience, and we hope stays in or around the industry. And that's one of the goals with our seasonal apiculturists. Greg Dugas is another one, and there's a couple of interesting things about Greg's story that I think are worth mentioning. Greg came to us as a high school student. In grade 12, he needed to do a certain number of days as a co-op placement. He had an interest in bees already because his family had a couple of colonies, and he'd been involved with beekeeping that way, and he wanted to learn more. So he came to us in grade 12, and I think it was 10 weeks. He had to do a day a week for 10 weeks, and he wanted to do something with beekeeping. So we'd never taken on a co-op student like that, but I would say if the opportunity ever presents it to anyone else, it can be very rewarding for both the student and for the employer. And Greg stayed with us. He came on as the co-op student in grade 12. He came on that summer as a seasonal apiculturist, and he stayed on for 4 years. And he just finished up this fall, late fall, the work that he was doing. And Greg's became an excellent hands-on beekeeper and really supports the practical work we do around honeybees. You might wonder as well in the picture why Greg is kind of pink. Everything's pink in that picture. I'll just explain it to satisfy people's curiosity in case they were wondering. We also, and I'm not going to talk about it much today unless people want to ask some questions, we also manage bumblebees. And that picture is Greg working under red lights in what we call, and it kind of sounds more glamorous perhaps than it is, but what we call our bumblebee lab. So that's why everything is that strange reddy pink color. John McDonald is another good story. John came to us in his second year as an undergraduate student. He had an interest in beekeeping already. He had very little experience, but he came on board. And again, John stayed with us for 4 years. In those 4 years, he finished his undergraduate degree. He did his honors degree with us related to beekeeping and varroa management, actually. And from there, he wanted to go on and do a master's. So we developed a master's project with Dalhousie University. I'll explain more about that specifically in a few minutes. And he's expecting to graduate this spring with his master's degree. And the expectation is John will go on and have some sort of career in and around blueberry production or beekeepers. In that time, he's also developed as a commercial beekeeper, and he and his wife manage a number of colonies that they use for wild blueberry pollination and for honey production. So I think it's again the information about the individuals, perhaps secondary to the stories behind them and how we as a tech transfer team like to bring people on who have an interest in beekeeping, develop that interest. We get people coming back, which always makes me feel good that we must be doing something right if people are coming back season after season, as they are also developing professionally themselves through their studies. And then they have an opportunity to work in our industry through the experience they've had in their own studies. So I just want to take an opportunity, as I say, not to talk about the individuals, but certainly the stories around them and how that's important to us as a tech transfer team. So that's the nutshell description of ADA and a lot of what we do. As I said, there's some natural breaks in this presentation. So I'd like to take a pause there, and I'd like to give an opportunity if anybody wants to put questions in the chat. I'm going to have a little drink, and then we'll talk more about the maritime industry. This is when you guys remind me that you're still with us, and I am actually talking to live people on the other end. While you're thinking about that, and feel free to throw the questions in. This picture here, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. This picture does nicely represent our industry because there's some honeybee colonies on a blueberry field, and that's quite typical. Actually, I think there's something different about this picture, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. All I'm going to say is my suspicion is I have a strong suspicion that this blueberry field is in Prince Edward Island. And there's a reason for that. But again, just to show the typical configuration of how we set up our honeybee colonies to send them off for blueberry pollination. The majority of commercial beekeepers will be palletizing their bees. And the most typical way that they do that is in this configuration. Some people still send singles, some people send doubles, most people send them 4 on a pallet. And then there is one beekeeper for his own unique reasons, has chosen a 6-pallet system for his honeybees.
So this looks very different from canola pollination, just based on Alberta beekeeping. Is there a reason that there's typically like this specific number of colonies in a blueberry field?
For the most part, we try to distribute the honeybees around the blueberry field. How you distribute bumblebees and leafcutter bees is different from honeybees, but we like to have them no more than 300 meters between each drop, as we call it. So you can see the second drop in the background there. And most depends on the scale, it depends on the size of the field. But again, you can see 8 colonies per drop is what this producer decided to do. Oftentimes, the bigger fields, the bigger producers with the larger commercial beekeeping operations will drop 6 pallets every couple of 100 meters throughout the field. Usually there's a roadway running down the length of the field or through a field, and they'll just drive their truck and drop, 4 or 6 pallets of bees intermittently through the field to get the coverage. Bees cover a blueberry field much better in terms of the distance they'll fly than bumblebees and leafcutter bees, but still we like to distribute them through the field. So that's why they're spread out like that. No one has commented on why I've said this is PEI. Maybe that's an unfair question. I'll give the answer quickly before we move along. Typically, we fence our colonies on blueberry fields against black bears, except in PEI where there's no black bears. So for the most part in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, we have to fence them to make sure that they don't get predated on by black bears. Okay, well, let's if there's no other questions, we can quickly move through the kind of the industry and talk about some of the key things. This diagram, again, I'm gonna talk around because I don't think we need to look at the numbers specifically. The colony numbers are on the axis there, and you can see them. But what I wanted to identify was the trends and the comparison in the scale of the industry. So you can see that Nova Scotia has the largest number of colonies in the Maritime region, followed by New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. We'll look more specifically at those numbers in a minute. But what's important to us, and you'll understand why shortly, what's important to us is the trends. And you can see that Nova Scotia, the trend is, and again, these numbers are up to 2024. We have some numbers for 2025, but usually the final numbers, we wait till the dust settles on the season, and then those are reported at the provincial apiculturists report those numbers at the CAPA meeting, which is next month, and those are kind of the definitive data for the seasons. But we can certainly see what we need to for today, looking up until 2024. So you can see that there's been some growth in Nova Scotia, and a slow and steady growth in the number of colonies over this 10-year period. I know this fall we put the largest number of honeybees away ever, which was just slightly in excess of 30,000. So you can see again that trend will continue. You can also see that the New Brunswick fairly flat. We had a bad winter last winter, and that has an impact. But unfortunately, you can see the trend for PEI is slowly the numbers seem to be decreasing. So with that in mind, I think we'll move on to look at the real numbers and what the demand is, because this sort of sets the scene for it. Overall, what we want to see is an increase in the number of honeybee colonies. So you can see for each province, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, they're represented by their provincial flags. You can see the numbers of colonies. There's some discrepancy in these numbers, and I'll explain maybe why when we go through them. But I think to contrast that with what would be expected in your own province is interesting. So firstly, you can see the scale of the beekeeping industry in the Maritimes is less than what you'd see in other provinces. We used to say that if you added all the colonies in the Maritimes together, were roughly equivalent to Quebec. I think we've slipped a little bit back from that. But certainly the other provinces would have more colonies than what we have in the individual maritime provinces. You can see the number of beekeepers there as well. A couple of interesting things to pick out of this is firstly that yield under the honey column, that yield figure, that's the per colony yield in honey for the average of the season, that representing that individual province. So when you compare that, and again, you would be looking at probably 40 to 45 kilograms per colony in Alberta. We produce much less honey. That's an important consideration for our province. Excuse me, and you can see it's variable across the three provinces. So Nova Scotia, 18.5 kilograms is the average honey yield per colony for our province. In the year 2024, it was much less in New Brunswick at 8.46 kilograms, and then probably somewhere in the middle there for Prince Edward Island. That's a significant challenge for beekeeping in the maritime region. You can see the crop figures there overall as well. So that's something that's worth noting in that first column under honey. When we move across to pollination, you'll see the colony numbers there differ from the hive numbers that I've put above the flags. And I've made that distinction so we can make a comparison. Those are the colony numbers overall for the province. So for example, Nova Scotia has around 29,000 colonies in 2024. Only 15,721 of those were used for pollination services. So not all the colonies in the province are used for pollination, obviously. So that's what these numbers represent. And then what we have is an estimate, most likely, of what the pollination fee was for that year. So you can see in Nova Scotia, a beekeeper could expect on average to get around $200 for a colony that went to wild blueberry pollination. You can see New Brunswick, and again, that reflects the demand. That estimated price is higher. And you can see the PEI again falls in the middle somewhere. So fewer colonies being used for pollination than held in the province, other than the figure of hives for PEI and then colonies used for pollination. One of the things that differs between Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI is that Nova Scotia and New Brunswick there's a regulatory requirement to register your hives. In PEI, it's voluntary registration, so the numbers don't always line up. For example, I know that the estimate of 25 given by the provincial apiculturist is not the number of beekeepers in in that province. There's probably more like 100 beekeepers in PEI, but 25 is the number of beekeepers that are likely using their colonies for commercial purposes, whether that's having 4 colonies and selling honey or 12 colonies and still going to pollination. That what triggers that count for the province. So it's very difficult to know how many beekeepers overall because they don't have to register, but we can make some informed decisions. So those would be beekeepers that are participating seriously in the industry, and that's why that number is so low. But nonetheless, I think it's a good reflection of the industry. So again, more colonies being used for pollination. But also what we've got to realize is, aside from Nova Scotia, which is fairly unique in that since 2018, that province has not allowed bees on comb to come in for pollination purposes across the border. Been a change last year. We did allow about 865 colonies. Those colonies actually probably have a connection to Alberta because they came from British Columbia, and some of you in the room, I'm probably talking to people who may be actually engaged in this. Alberta bees go to BC for overwintering, and then they may travel back to the eastern part of the country for wild blueberry pollination. And that seems to be a more common model and something we're looking at as an industry. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the industry. One of the things we also need to look at is what the expectation over the next number of years are going to be, because this is going to impact every beekeeper in the country. And you can see here, and I'll go through this quickly, but this is just information. It's available if we wanted to read the entire New Brunswick wild blueberry pollination strategy. The executive summary of that is available online, and you can just Google that. But you can see that those colony numbers that we have now and what the expectation of the industry is by 2029, all those numbers are roughly doubling. So we will be looking to bring as many bee hives, as many colonies, as many gallons of leafcutter bees, and as many bumblebee quads as we can possibly get into Eastern Canada, particularly into New Brunswick. So there will be bees coming from Alberta. There will be bees coming. There already is. We have imported bees into New Brunswick from as far away as Mexico for wild blueberry pollination. That shows us what the demand is. Now, those were bumblebees, which is a little bit different. Certainly wouldn't import honeybees from Mexico, but nonetheless, it shows what the demand is. And this demand, as it increases over the next number of years, they will be looking for more bees, and they will be looking for bees from places maybe we didn't get a lot of bees from before. So whether that's Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, we get thousands of colonies from Ontario already, and we get some from Quebec. But again, Quebec has its own need for wild blueberry pollination. So if we look at that in Nova Scotia as well, Nova Scotia is a little bit different. New Brunswick is opening up new production acres of wild blueberries, and that's what's driving the demand. As we increase the acreage of blueberries, we get an increase in demand. In Nova Scotia, that demand is going to be largely driven by increasing yield expectations. So when we look at these figures, you can see the number of colonies, honeybee colonies used for pollination in 2024, an estimate of the number of non-apis or bumblebees used. And we know that there's just over 1.1 units, I guess we could say hives, 1.1 hives per acre. When we are increasing yields on wild blueberry fields, we have to do that by increasing the number of pollinators. So the expectation is that as the industry moves towards efficiencies and increasing yields, that will increase from just over 1 unit to an average of 3 units per acre. So that will again increase the demand, and regionally, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, that demand is probably going to be 80 to 100,000 honeybee colonies per year will be needed for for wild blueberry production. Some of that demand will be met by by bumblebees, some by leafcutter bees as well. But the expectation is probably 3/4 of that demand will be met by increasing the number of honeybees. And as I say, coming from all over Canada. The other strong consideration, as I mentioned in our industry, is the decrease in honey production. And Alberta beekeepers will be quite shocked to see the figures that we are getting for honey production. You can see these trend lines. Sawyer Olmsted, our provincial apiarist here in Nova Scotia, did this figure, and it really shows the trend. The interesting things to take out of this, and I'll just talk as you're looking at that figure. You can see the blue line is the average yield per hive. So again, this is in pounds, don't forget, not kilograms again. So if we're making comparison, I would say that probably in Alberta last year, the average was 110 to 115 pounds per colony. Certainly individual colonies got more and some less, but the average being just over 100 pounds. And you can see what we're looking at now is around 40 pounds per colony. So much less production. That is showing a downward trend, and we've probably lost about 20% of our honey production across the region. Maybe PEI not quite so much as Nova Scotia, but certainly New Brunswick and PEI and Nova Scotia have seen that decrease. So that's income out of the pockets of beekeepers. And the other interesting thing about these trend lines, when you look at the number of honey producing hives, which is the red line, there is not a clear relationship between the number of honey producing colonies and honey production. And that's represented there, I think most drastically in 2020, when we seem to have the fewest honey producing colonies, yet our per hive or per colony yields were the highest at 61 pounds. So you can see as we're increasing the number of, from 2021, increasing the number of colonies, that we're actually getting less per colony. So this is significant for our industry because, as I said, the economic impacts are direct to the honey, to the beekeeper. Quickly moving on, again, talking about the other important aspect of beekeeping is winter losses. And Nova Scotia, aside from Newfoundland, which is not a fair comparison because they don't have the challenge of Varroa, Nova Scotia actually has the usually about the lowest winter losses provincially across the country. You can see that's changing. You can see 2024 was very high losses. With that blue line or red line representing Nova Scotia, you can see again a creep of the overall trend for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick upward. And again, they up until recently, they follow each other fairly closely. And you can see the variability in PEI. Sometimes PEI is in line with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, other years it's not. So that variability is important for us because that impacts on planning for wild blueberry pollination. Low and consistent winter losses is what we want for wild blueberry production. So again, some trends there, and interesting to just note that the Maritime region together, even with PEI's overall average for the last 5 years being quite high, you can see that the Maritime region usually falls below Canada. But again, if you look at 23 and 24, it's a bit all over the place. New Brunswick was as high as 32%, dropped back down again to a reasonable below 20%. For Nova Scotia, rather. New Brunswick again jumped way up last year to 45%, and then PEI went from 61% down to 22%, showing that variability. So these winter loss considerations, as beekeepers across the country monitor this, are really important to us. In our region, we consider 30% is what you can recover from in a season. So if you get up to 30%, like Nova Scotia did in the winter 23-24, then by the end of the 24 season, we would expect to be back to where we were previously. And that's exactly what happened. We had slightly more colonies going into the winter of 2024-25 after that previous winter's high losses of 32%. So that's in a ballpark of where we feel we can get to, and we plan now for 30% winter loss if for our industry. So interesting to break that down a bit. And there's a couple of things that I'm just going to talk about quickly that we've discovered. We looked at this for New Brunswick a couple of years ago, and on the right, you can see this represents how we divide our industry up. If you have 50 colonies, you're considered commercial. In that category of 50 to 200 or 199, you're considered to be a sideliner. So you have to have some other source of income into your household, but you are still a commercial beekeeper. And then from 200 to 1,000, you're considered full-time. That's a full-time job. The unfortunate reality of it, probably between 200 and 500, it's not yet a full-time income. But then from 500 to 1,000, those people are considered engaged in beekeeping full time. And then we have a third category above 1,000, which represents our larger commercial beekeepers. What we found with this, didn't surprise us, is that the beekeepers who are at risk for the highest winter loss are those commercial sideliners. Those are the people that will incur higher winter losses because they aren't dedicated full time to managing their colonies. And that conflict between a full time job, all the other commitments of life, and beekeeping seems to be what is creating a situation for high winter loss. And then when you get to the largest scale commercial beekeepers of 1,000 plus, they're full time dedicated to beekeeping with staff, and they manage their winter losses better than the smaller scale commercial beekeepers. The diagram on the left just shows the variability in the commercial bee and the non-commercial beekeepers. Those are our hobbyists for the same period, just to contrast that. And you can see that it just seems to depend on the season with the hobbyists, whether they have high or low winter losses. But the clear trends are there with the other three groups of commercial beekeepers. Okay, so that brings us up to just talking about a couple of examples of challenges that we help beekeepers address in our region. I'm not quite sure where we are for time. I think we're still doing well.
Yep,
And
I
we've
think
got
we've
about a
still
half.
got 30 minutes left on
Okay.
this meeting.
Okay. Well, we'll pause then for a second because that was a lot.
That was.
And I just wonder if there's questions. The difference in the scale of the industry, I think, is so obvious when we talk about the number of beekeepers and the number of colonies. Um, I think the honey production would also be a shock for people.
Yeah, it seems like a very different system than Alberta, for sure.
Without the pollination of wild blueberries, our industry would look completely different. Now that per colony average for honey production without the wild blueberry pollination. So if we took the colonies that we don't need for wild blueberry pollination and just concentrate on honey production, that number would creep back up. But because we've seen a lot of changes, we had the worst drought in 100 years in Nova Scotia last year. That impacted on honey production, not as much as what we worried that it would, because I think it's kind of a little bit of a compromise, because when you're in drought conditions, although the nectar flow is less, the flying days are more. So the opportunity for the bees to get out and forage, they're not stuck at home because of rainy days. So they can still get out and fly quite broadly. So we had an excellent year for the bees to fly, but it wasn't an excellent year for nectar flow. So it is kind of a balance. So the production was down, but it wasn't as drastic as as we expected. In contrast, though, I'll just mention we had blueberry fields this year that the blueberries were so tiny and shriveled up because of the drought that they couldn't even harvest them because the mechanical harvesters have tines and the blueberries have to be a certain size to get captured by the tines, and they knew they would just fall into the ground when they tried to harvest them. So some fields were 100% lost. I think they're estimating about an 80% reduction in the wild blueberry crop last year in parts of Nova Scotia. And overall, the region was down as well. And that has a huge impact on beekeepers because a couple of things worth mentioning about the wild blueberry industry. There's a huge fluctuation in the field price for blueberries. So a couple of years ago, we were hovering at 30, 40 cents a pound off the blueberry field, and that's well below the cost of production. So we're growing this commodity that goes into a global market, and price is a strong factor. Our price now has gone up over 80 cents, which again is good, but we've had a couple of years that people were operating and selling their product at below the cost of production. And then this year we had a serious drought. So when the industry which we rely so heavily on is impacted like that, then it's very difficult for us to supply a service, which is probably the biggest cost to blueberry production. Pollination service is the largest individual cost for blueberry producers. So that's beyond the agrochemicals they use, that's beyond the diesel they need to drive their tractors, etc. So when money's short, it does impact on the demand. And as beekeepers, we can't it's very difficult for us to respond to the demand quickly. So if I'm talking to my blueberry producer today, and he says, I want 25% fewer colonies, it's like, well, it's too late. They're already there. They're in winter, and I've targeted, for what you needed previously. Alternatively, if they say I want 25% more, this time of year, we can't do anything about that. So we're 2 years. We've got to be 2 years ahead of the demand. And when the price is fluctuating, and then you've got other problems like drought, it's very difficult to know what that demand will be. But there's still optimism in the wild blueberry industry, and they're still planning to put the inputs in. Inputs being, fertilizers and herbicides, pesticides, and honeybees and other bees. All right.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. The
Prizes for
question
those that
is,
ask questions.
what is the current status of queen rearing in your region? Do you have a sufficient number of queen producers? Does your climate condition allow for that?
Again, with the wild blueberry industry driving the beekeeping industry, our demand for colonies is in the very earliest part of the season, and I'll explain a little bit more because I thought that people would be interested in that as something that differs from maybe your own experience in your province. So we need to get our bees onto blueberry fields early in the season. For us to produce the honey, the queens that we need that early is we can't do it. So we kind of have we call them early and late queens, and that doesn't make any sense to anybody that isn't always focused on the wild blueberry industry. So the early queens will be the ones that we get in probably the 1st of May. And those would go towards if we're doing any early splits before blueberry production. So if you've got a very strong colonies, you don't want to send those to blueberry production because they'll swarm on the blueberry fields. So we have a standard that is a high strength standard. that we strive to achieve for wild blueberry production, and colonies that exceed that by very much will just swarm. So we'll split them. We'll balance the colonies in preparation. So as part of that process, we need some queens early in the season to do that balancing and splitting before wild blueberry pollination. So those have to be imported. Then after the bees come back from wild blueberries is when we do most of our splitting for the year. So the majority of the growth in hive numbers would come after wild blueberry production. And for that, we really like to rely on local queens. But to answer the question specifically, no, there is not enough queen producers in our region. And there is the challenge with those early queens not being available locally. So we do import lots of queens from, well, where we can get them. But we're working on it. And again, overwintering queen banks is something we're very interested in. There's some good work being done in Quebec about overwintering indoors, banks of queens. We're looking at, and hopefully it's one of our projects that I wasn't planning on talking about it today, but I'll mention it, that we've done a couple of years of trials on overwintering outdoors, and we hope to pick that up again this season. So one of the challenges of tech transfer is with the soft funding, we do have turnover of staff, and with that, every time the staff changes, and I know that the Alberta Tech Transfer team is going through transition right now, and some aspects of what you do have to not start from the beginning, but it's like a reset button. So we had someone on staff who was whose background was queen production, and she helped us to do some outdoor banking trials, and she went on to do something else, and we've got someone now who's got some expertise on queen production. So hopefully we'll return to that. And I'm kind of out of the picture when it comes to queen production, because although I live in Fredericton, I spend a lot of time in Nova Scotia, and you can't do queen production and live in two provinces, I've found. So it's a challenge, but that's what we're looking at as an industry: increase the number of queen producers, increase the number of queens being produced locally, and then looking at alternatives like indoor banking, outdoor banking, overwintering nukes, etc.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Um,
Right. So was there
well,
something else?
there was one more question if we have the
Okay.
time.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy for the pause.
When do the bees usually go into blueberries? Average dates? How long are they in pollination for?
That's an excellent question. Can I beg off and not answer it and say, just wait, give me a minute? Because that's one of that question is one of the things we focus on with our research. So I will answer that more than fully in just a few minutes. And I appreciate the question. And it's rare for me to say I'm not going to answer a question, but I will answer it. But just sit tight for a minute and we'll get round to it.
For sure.
Okay. Anyone recognize what that picture is? I hope there isn't anybody. Wouldn't it be lovely if somebody said, I've never seen one of those? I'd love to do a presentation once that I didn't talk about Varroa. That's my goal, is to have it become such an insignificant thing that we don't even need to talk about it. But unfortunately, when we're talking about challenges for beekeepers, it's got to be number one, and not just Varroa, but the associated viruses that are so damaging to our bees. So I'm going to talk about Varroa, and then I'm going to move on quite quickly to talk more about blueberry production, because I think when we're talking about Varroa, that's such a common theme across our country. All of the tech transfer teams dedicate huge amounts of their time to helping beekeepers with this. We go out and we help beekeepers directly. We'll help them apply their acaricides. We'll do testing. We'll do monitoring for them. We'll do monitoring with them. In fact, if our phone rings and anybody says, need help with Varroa, we just jump in the car half the time and head out where it's possible. So this takes a lot of our energy and a lot of our resources. But one of the things that we are doing, aside from all the usual things, the training and there's some great new products coming on the market this year for Varroa management. We're really excited about that. We'll be doing some training. We are already doing, if you don't read our blog, What's the Buzz with Ada? Have a look at it. It's probably the best way we get information into the hands of beekeepers. We have hundreds of beekeepers in our region read that every week, and thousands of beekeepers. We've had 250,000 people read our blog over the couple of years, probably 3 or 4 years we've been doing it. So it's a great way to get information. And when new products come along, we always put something in our blog. So that's available weekly to people. What's the Buzz with Ada? And you can just Google that and find it quite easily. But one of the things we're doing more specifically when it comes to varroa mites in our region, what we were tasked with in discussions with the industry, is, okay, we need to know where we are with varroa management, how good a job we're doing, what are the patterns we're seeing, what are the trends, how well are our products working. And to answer some of those questions, we started 2 years ago. We've done 2 seasons of what will be 3 seasons of data collection. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to get a real good survey or sample of the industry. So when I say that, we're not talking a lot of, I think we collected just over 200 samples in total last year. What we wanted to do was get a broad, not deep, but a broad representation of our industry. So if I was to tell you that 3 beekeepers in New Brunswick, and this is just an estimate on the fly, but 3 beekeepers in New Brunswick manage 75% of the commercial colonies, 75% of the total number of colonies in the province. 3 beekeepers, 75% of the colonies. In Nova Scotia, again, it would be 3 commercial beekeepers managing 3/4 of all of the colonies. So if we're targeting, as we have done, commercial beekeepers who send their bees to wild blueberry pollination, that's the target we wanted for this survey. And we got between 8 and 10 of those commercial beekeepers, including the largest commercial beekeepers in our region. We are, that represents the management of probably over 80% of all the colonies in the province. So we set out to do that, and those are sort of the numbers we're looking at. We and people kind of come and go, and we're very appreciative of beekeepers' time because this is extra work, but they see the value and the importance of it. So what we do is we target 8 to 10 commercial beekeepers in Nova Scotia, 8 to 10 in New Brunswick. We get what we can in PEI. Again, it's very different, and there's a much smaller number of commercial beekeepers. And we ask them for samples. We ask them for samples at important points in our beekeeping season, which is 1, before pollination of wild blueberries, and you'll know exactly when that is in a minute, mid-season, and then after honey harvest. So at those 3 important points, we wanted to survey the industry. And what we want to do is we want to get an idea of what the growth pattern of varroa is across that time period. And you can see in that simple diagram below, you can see those 2 years worth of data. You can see that first time point pre-pollination, midpoint would be trial 2, and then the third point after honey production. So that's quite typical when you're looking at phoretic mites, which is what we're testing for. When we're collecting a sample of bees and doing a wash, we're looking at phoretic mites to see that increase in the number. So we wanted to get an idea of that pattern and what we found across the 2 years we've done so far. Well, I'll summarize in a minute after I explain what our objectives were really. So that was one thing that we wanted to do. We wanted also to look specifically at the efficacy of amitraz. as our most important chemical acaricide, we wanted to look at Apivar and specifically at Amitraz. We wanted to get those temporal trends, those over time benchmarks for the varroa burden in our region. We also wanted to collect some samples for further testing, which we'll talk about. So we've been doing this for a couple of years. We've seen differences already. One of the side benefits of this, I guess, one of the outcomes that we didn't anticipate fully, we talk about varroa all the time. We go to meetings, and I'm sure I hear the sighs and see the eyes roll when we start to talk about varroa. But everybody knows how important those messages are, in spite of the fact that they might be exhausted talking about varroa. They know that it's an important message. But because we've engaged the industry, especially those key players that I mentioned before, we've engaged the industry in monitoring and just having a constant awareness of what's going on with the varroa. It's changed practices. It's raised the profile of varroa as something that is absolutely necessary to concentrate your management on, and that's been great. So what we saw was that the statistical difference between trial one, season 1 and 2, trial 2, season 1 and 2, trial 3, season 1 and 2, no significant statistical difference between the mite numbers across there. You can see if you look at that figure that we're using 1% now as the threshold for treatment. What we say to beekeepers in the Maritimes is that you need to manage your colonies so that your varroa levels are below 1%. So that is in a sample of 300 bees, which is typical for a wash. You want no more than 2, because when you get to 3, that's your 1%. So no more than 2 in a wash. And you can see that when we get to the third trial, we're on average approaching, or on average above that 1% mark for treatment, which fits in with our management so far. Is that most beekeepers remove their honey supers and then apply their fall treatment to knock the numbers down. Whether that's ideal, I think, is worth discussing, because in some aspects it isn't. So we've seen that pattern. We've got good data for 2 years. We're going to get the third year, and then we'll have that benchmark. And in 2 years, if we say, okay, maybe things are changing, let's do it again, and we have a comparison. So that's important for us in our region to have that. One of the things that's come out of it, again, peripherally, is that what we're seeing too is that when beekeepers are sampling in their yards, we'll see, okay, overall things look good, and things do look good for our region. Mite numbers are low and kept below what we would say is manageable. So the beekeepers are doing a good job. But what we're also seeing in individual apiaries and with individual beekeepers is that you'll go through, and for the most part, that is the case. And then you're seeing a varroa bomb, we call it, one that has high levels in the group. And that's either because this is the start of the reducing efficacy of Amitraz and Apivar, or it's down to different management of those colonies. Maybe the strips didn't get in the right place in that one. Maybe we had a colony that was particularly strong, and we knew that the mites will grow in those because it should have been split and it wasn't. So there is other factors as well, but for the most part, we're seeing these spikes in individual colonies, which is worrisome and something we're talking to beekeepers about and trying to do some work around. And when we do our testing of Amitraz, we work with the active ingredient. So you can do in-field testing. A Pettis test is a good example of that. And that looks at the efficacy of Apivar, if that's what the product is you're looking at. So you can look specifically at the efficacy of Apivar and get a good idea for that. That's a great tool to have in our toolbox. What we do is we expose the individual mites to the active ingredient. So the field test exposes bees that are infested with mites to the product. So bees exposed to Apivar. What we do is we expose the mites to amitraz. And with that, we get what's called a resistance ratio, and then that gives us an idea of the efficacy of the product overall. So what we've come away from this with so far is that we would say in our region that Apivar and amitraz is somewhat effective. And instead of having specific numbers, we prefer to work in categories. So in the scientific literature, how that would be defined, somewhat effective, is between 80 and 89% efficacy of that product. We're quite confident that there's some slippage in that efficacy, but it seems that Apivar, with the active ingredient amitraz in our region, still has enough efficacy that makes it a valuable product for our beekeepers. So that's one of the things that we do. So we'll do year 3 of 3 next year and repeat this, get other good data. And as I say, a lot of the benefit that have come out of this is not something we had anticipated when we went into it, but it is certainly become a point now of discussion with real local data to look at, which is much more meaningful to our beekeepers. So that's one example of how we're working with our industry to support some of the challenges. And the other thing that I'm just going to spend the next few minutes on is something that maybe isn't as familiar with people. So it's really important for us here, but again, as a difference in the industries across the country, I think it's a great one for us to explore today as a group. So in the next 10 minutes, I'll just go through this quickly. Stop me if there's questions along the way. But the main challenge for blueberry producers is that there's the production season is altering. So there's been some really good data out of Maine that has shown, to summarize it, that in the last 20 seasons, the wild blueberry production season has lengthened by 14 days. So that means that conventional benchmarks for production decisions can no longer rely on the calendar. They have to rely on other tools. And what's indicated in this diagram, which seems to make the situation worse, it doesn't seem to, it absolutely does, is that when you look at the changes in temperature in the state of Maine, and this would apply to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia as well, and we're grateful for the work that was done in Maine, but the applicable in our provinces, we're sure that not only are we seeing changes in the temperature of the province or the state, but it seems that there's a phenomenon where wild blueberry fields, the changes in temperature are beyond what we would see for the average for that area, that state or that province. So that's presenting great challenges for our producers. And how that's kind of manifesting is that, and I'm going to talk, and this is the start to answer that great question that was put to me. What we do as pollinators is we concentrate on what's called the bloom period. So obviously what that's going to be is when the plant that we're pollinating, in this case wild blueberries, is in flower. So what we need to do is we need to time the placement of our managed pollinators along with the opening of those flowers on the blueberry stems. So you can see this diagram here, and I'm going to talk about growing degree days and I'll explain it. What it represents is that nice bell curve that will show, okay, this is when the flowers, the buds that are on the blueberry stems start to open and they're receptive. For about 3 days, optimal pollination. 4. Beyond that, it's the quality of pollination is less. So we've got about 4 days for that open flower to get an insect to pollinate it. And then across the field, we see all of those flowers open to the point where they have all opened or are open, 100% open flowers, and then those flowers drop off, petal drop as we call it. So that's what's changing. So that representation there from the 8th of May to the 31st of June is what those data points in that diagram, again, giving us an idea of when wild blueberry pollination is. But because of those changes that I just described, what's actually happening is the decision about when to put pollinators seems to be made with less accuracy. So what we want to do is we want to strive to put our pollinators into the fields at 10% to probably 25% bloom. And that is optimal. And what we've seen with some of the data that we've pulled together is that that is not happening. What we're getting is the colonies arriving too late, and then we're not getting optimal pollination, which means we're not getting optimal yield. So what's needed to do this more efficiently is some data and some information. And I'm going to go through some background just so we understand a little bit about what's going on. And I think for anybody that's working commercially with bees, anywhere in Canada, it's probably a good thing to have a fundamental knowledge of growing degree days, because this is the language that's being used now with bee. We teach beekeeping and we teach beekeepers about growing degree days. And I'm going to get into that with us today a little bit. But in order to understand that as well, you have to understand a little bit about the phenology or the growth pattern of wild blueberries. So one of the things that we have to understand is that we have 20,000 acres of wild blueberries in Nova Scotia. Because of the crop cycle, only half of those acres are in production each year. We have a sprout year and we have a crop year. So 20,000 of the 40,000 acres will be harvested in that year. During the sprout year, we have important events going on. The individual sprouts of the blueberry plant grow up from a rhizome. That's what we refer to as ramid emergence. And they grow through the season until about August. And then what's called the apical meristem is the top of that plant, and it dies. That's tip dieback. And then the plant goes into a dormancy period. And in order to go into and successfully come out of that dormancy period, that plant needs a certain amount of cold days, chilling requirements, we call it. And once the chilling requirements have been achieved, the plant then develops buds. Those buds develop into bloom in the crop year. That bloom is pollinated, and then we have fruit development. So that's the cycle of wild blueberry production. So when we come in, if you look at that diagram in the crop year, at that bloom period, that's when we're applying our pollinators. So there we have that same diagram again, and we can start to see that it's recognized in the industry that what we need is better tools. And again, back to the point, we can't rely on conventional seasonal benchmarks. So keep that little bell curve there in mind as we go through the next couple of bits of information. So in our region, we're very, very lucky because we have a network of on-farm weather stations. So what we can do is we can assess the daily mean temperature. From that, we can equate that to a model, which we call growing degree days, based on the warming units that allow the plant to grow. We have a temperature from which we know the plant will grow, and we have a start date for that growth. So the growing degree day model that we apply for wild blueberries, it starts on April 1st. And in order for there to be an accumulation of these warming units, which we call growing degree days, it has to be above 0 degrees Celsius. That's the current model. This information from these on-farm weather stations can be accessed by the growers who have, in Nova Scotia, I think we have 50 or 60 across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, 50 or 60 of these on-farm weather stations in blueberry fields for decision making. And that is also fed into another farm data tool, which is the screen capture there that's showing the Perennia farm data tool. So growers can access this information from the farm data tool for any of the weather stations and for their own particular fields if they have an on-farm weather station. So our current model, which we can see there in that lovely bell curve, what we are doing is we are taking the model which was developed by Dr. Scott White in 2012. We're working with him and John McDonald, who I mentioned earlier, to redevelop that model and make it more precise. We're using more fields, a broader geographic region. We're taking into consideration the base temperature and those chilling requirements for a more accurate start date. So we can develop this model to help blueberry producers time the placement of their colonies more precisely and more efficiently against that model, which we can see in the figure there. So what we hope to achieve out of this, just to summarize quickly, because I think we're just out of time, is we're bringing together all of the technology that's available to us. What can't be ignored is what's shown in that top diagram, the expertise of the grower, the field scouting. Growers still need to go out into their fields and they need to look at them. They need to take that data from their on-farm weather station. They need to drive that into a predictive plant model, which I've shown you, which is the growing degree day model. That model then is fed into the agri-technology platforms, that's that farm data tool. And then with that, the timing of placement of colonies for wild blueberry production can be more efficient, get better use out of the few colonies we have, take a little bit of pressure off some of those demands I've talked about, and overall support the industry in getting a better crop and better yield. So that's where we're going with this technology and some of the research that we're involved with around it. So that's all I had intended to present. Unfortunately, maybe we didn't have as much time for questions at the end. I'm happy to stay for a few minutes if people want to, but otherwise they can contact me. I'm more than happy to hear from people, and especially if it helps to give a perspective of what we're doing in Eastern Canada, and for me to better understand perhaps what you're doing in your own province.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. If you'd like, we have one question in the chat, and then we could wrap up for the session.
Sure.
All right, the question is, what is the required hive strength for pollination?
All right, well, that is an excellent question as well, and I'll sum it up. But again, it has to be considered in context, because as you saw, if we're looking at, and the data that I presented showed that bloom period, the data collection started the 8th of May, but we're looking at a couple of weeks probably down the road for most beekeepers to have their colonies ready for the middle of May for wild blueberries. So we can only achieve a certain hive strength at that time of year. And then again, we don't want to exceed it because we'll lose bees to swarming. So what we do is we put forward a hive standard, which is based on the number of bees, and I can tell you the number of bees, and if anybody wants to count them, they can. About 20,000 bees in the box. We also say, okay, how much brood should there be in total? And we say 4 frames of brood. Now that's not 4 frames with brood, that's 4 frames of brood. So if you take all the brood that's in the box, put it together, it should equal 4 frames. 7 or 8 frames of bees, which is the same thing. That's all of the bees added up, because as you know, as beekeepers, those outside frames have few. The middle ones will be full. So we say 7 or 8 frames of bees. A laying queen, which is another contentious point, but for our purposes, we say there should be a laying queen. And it should be, and again, the standard has to make it, you have to make decisions on standards, two deep Langstroth 10 frame boxes. So that's what a package looks like. And that would be at the point in which where the bees land for pollination, at the beginning of the bloom, not at the end. Because again, those colonies are going through rapid growth over those 2 or 3 weeks they're on a blueberry field. So what comes off a blueberry field in a good season is going to be a lot more than what went on it. So it has to be for blueberry pollination. It has to be at that particular point in time. It also has to be an average because we know every colony is not going to be the same. So there's some complexity around creating a hive standard, but those are the general principles that we look at.
Awesome. Thank you for the answer. And thank you to everyone for attending today. I hope you all learned something. I know I did. And hopefully we will see you at our next Hive-side Chat in February. Thanks again, Andrew. That was really great.